Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Ryan Pronzinski of Christ Lutheran Church, and this is my Chair Chat Daily Devotional for Friday, May 1st. Happy May Day, everyone, as my grandma texted me this morning. As a reminder, these daily devotionals are intended to help you engage your life of faith during this time of pandemic where you're unlikely to get to in-person worship, Bible study, and small group, things of that nature. And as I had a parishioner tell me on the phone yesterday, I can't get my normal devotional materials, Pastor, so I provide this to you all so that you have a way to engage your life of faith in that way as well. With all that in mind, I encourage you throughout this video to pause and reflect. Take notes, journal, talk to the people around you, and you don't have to do the whole video at once, pause it. Also, there's a comment section below, so please, I encourage you to leave constructive comments, questions, or even prayer requests, and I know that I promise to get to those in the following videos. Other people who watch these can respond to those comments, questions, and even the prayer requests themselves too. So please feel free to do that. The readings that come each day in these videos come from the Daily Revised Common Lectionary, which is a church reading schedule that can be found online. The readings for today are Psalm 23. I will not be reading that today, but you can see April 30th for details, which is yesterday's video. The other readings are Exodus 3, 16 to 22, and chapter 4, 18 to 20. And then 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17. These readings are in the description below. Before I get to the readings themselves, as always, I'd like to invite you all to come and join us at Christ Lutheran Church for worship on Sunday mornings. We do a Facebook live stream at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so please join us. If you can't join us for the live stream, they do get recorded and posted, and you can watch the recordings as well. The link to those videos is posted in the description below, so please come join us. All right, all that being said, we continue on with the readings, starting with Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 4. Go and assemble the elders of Israel, and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, God of Abraham, and of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you, and to what has been done to you in Egypt. I declare that I will bring you up out of the misery of Egypt, to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go on a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by my mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it. After that, he will let you go. I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not simply leave empty-handed. Each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for her jewelry, for silver and gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you shall plunder the Egyptians. Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they are still living. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are now dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses carried the staff that God had given him in his hand. Here ends the reading. So I know that we didn't read the 23rd Psalm in this video today, but the one verse, I think it was verse 6, the beginning of it, from the 23rd Psalm reads as follows. Goodness and mercy shall follow me. And I talked about that in the video yesterday. And I mention it today because we see here in Exodus what goodness and mercy following you can look like. So in Exodus, it looks like this. When you've gone from being a slave with having nothing to not only being freed, right, which is amazing and miraculous enough in itself, but then freely given the gold and silver of your captors and clothes. I forgot about the clothes. And then you leave your captors untouched and unscathed, right? That is what goodness and mercy following you looks like. That's God leading you through a dark valley to a place of abundance. I can't even fathom that. You are the slaves. You are seen as less than human and important. And then you go from that to not only being freed, but the people that were your captors just throwing their most valuable stuff at you, being like, just get out of here and take our riches with you. That is amazing deliverance and abundance from God, and goodness and mercy following God's people. That's pretty great. And I imagine the Hebrews, the people of Israel, right, saying or thinking to themselves, man, we'll just be happy getting freed. Just free us, God. That's all we need. You know, what is all this talk about gold and silver? Like, that's excessive. That's not necessary. But we are reminded in this Exodus story that God is not a God of scarcity, nor is God a God of mediocrity. Right? Our God is a God of abundance. Your God, the God whose image you are created in, is a God of abundance. You are created in the image of a God of generosity and abundance. And we also are reminded that God keeps God's promises, right? Which, of course, God promised to deliver God's people in the Exodus. But also God's original promise back in the beginning of Genesis for all of us and all of creation. Be fruitful and multiply. That is both a command and a promise, because God created us to be able to do so, to be abundant and have abundant life. So the promise of abundance continues even after being enslaved in Exodus. And so what a turnaround that God has brought for God's people. It wasn't easy. I know we haven't read the whole story, but it isn't easy. It takes many attempts. There are several plagues and many conversations with Pharaoh several times where either Pharaoh hardens his heart or God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And it doesn't happen quickly, but it happens. Right? What God says will happen, the gold and the silver and the freedom that God says God will give the people, they get it. And so this situation of being delivered in such an abundant way has me thinking this, that I want to ask you all. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought to yourself, you know what, I just want to get out of this situation as quickly and quietly as possible, and that will be blessing enough? I just want to get out of this situation as quickly and quietly as possible, and that will be blessing enough. That will be a victory, right? And then, in the process of getting out of this situation, you ended up getting more out of it than you thought. Right? So it's kind of a twofold question. Have you ever been in a situation where you're like, I just want to get out of this thing as quickly and quietly as possible? And then in the process of getting through that situation, you end up actually getting more out of it than you thought was possible. Kind of like the Hebrews in today's reading, right? I'm pretty confident they didn't think, one, that they'd be freed, and then two, not only would they be freed, but they'd end up with an abundance of gold, silver, and clothing. And I'm having you think about these questions because I wonder if we are feeling like slaves right now, just like the slaves in Exodus, right? Except we are slaves to COVID-19, right? We're locked down from handshakes, high fives, hugs, fist bumps, kisses, right? And close social interaction and a lot of other things too. And we too would be glad to simply, quickly, and quietly get out of this. That would be enough for us. But I wonder, might the God of Exodus, the God of deliverance, the God of abundance, be seeking to make sure that we too, as God's people, walk away with, gold and silver and clothing on our way out too, right? And what does that gold and silver, that abundance, look like as we walk through and out of this situation? Does it look like deepening family relationships with all this time that people have had to spend together and maybe not have to work? Does it look like greater unity and peace amongst the nations and peoples as we work together to cure and overcome this common enemy in this coronavirus? Does it look like much needed innovation for doing church, like right now? Teaching, medicine, technology, and supply chain, and so much more. All this innovating that's happening. Does it look like rediscovering one's spiritual life and reconnecting with God? As so many of my colleagues say to me, boy, we have more people viewing our stuff online than we've ever had at person in our church buildings and in our physical spaces. People are hungry. Might it be that? And I name all these things because I see all of these things that I've suggested and more as possible social gold that we will plunder from this pandemic amidst the loss and hardship. And I do recognize there is loss and hardship as God leads us to freedom. So what do you think? What do you think? Where have you seen the gold and silver as we are delivered from this slavery to COVID-19 full of hardship and loss? How is God bringing about abundance through it? All right, on to 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme, or of governors as sent by him to punish those who are doing wrong and to praise those who are doing right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Here ends the reading. Boy, I had a lot of thoughts as I first read this, but here we go. I'm going to jump in. Here we have a statement of faith from Peter about how we should conduct ourselves as followers of Jesus who live in civil society, right? And how we should conduct ourselves in civil society as followers of Jesus, since God is our deliverance and our God is a God of abundance, right? As followers of Jesus, we are called to be, are not called to be a violently rebellious people against governments and authorities in power. The Exodus shows us why this is true, right? The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and they themselves did not physically and violently, rebelliously uprise, right? And why not? Because God delivered them. Okay? However, and I do throw in a however here, this honoring of those in authority is true for those who are in power but are doing so honorably, right? As Peter himself says, those who are punishing the wrong and praising those who are doing right. And so when we face evil leadership, because we can and we will, We are called to passive resistance. Now, this is not directly in 1 Peter. I'm going to jump around in the Bible a little bit because this is important to me, and I want you all to hear this too. Firstly, Paul writes himself in Romans 12, right? Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Or as Jesus says in John, those who live by the sword die by the sword, right? And in other places in the gospel, Jesus says to turn the other cheek. Now I'm going to get into what this means. Because this turning of the cheek is a form of passive resistance, right? Jesus doesn't say run away. That's flight or fleeing. That's passivism, right? Just run away. And Jesus doesn't say fight, right? That's violence. So it's not fight, it's not flight, which are our two natural human reactions. Jesus calls us to be elevated beyond our reacting and to respond with passive resistance. Jesus has turned the other cheek because by doing so, you force the person who's hit you once, this is in Jesus' day, into one of two situations. They either disengage you immediately, right? Because, dude, it takes courage to get hit once and then stand there with confidence and say, I will take another hit from you. There's more to it than that. And the violence is stopped. Or this is the more likely scenario that makes them disengage with you, right? Because if they hit you with the other hand, right? So they typically are going to be hitting you first with their right hand and smacking you across the cheek. And then now once they do that, the only way, and they'll probably backhand you, I don't know how it works exactly, but the way it functions is once they hit you with the one hand and your head turns the one way, then the only other way they can hit you is with their left hand, right? But that's the hand they wipe themselves with, okay? That's how this works in the culture of Jesus' day and in some cultures still today. You only wipe with one hand. And so then to hit somebody with that hand is disgraceful. It's shameful. And to do so would bring shame upon that person, and not only on that person, but on their family, because Jesus lived in a shame-honor culture. Hence the word honor gets used in Peter's language, right? We don't want to bring shame upon ourselves. We want to bring honor upon other people and God. And so, yeah, Jesus has turned the other cheek because if they hit you, they'll bring shame upon themselves. And if they do that, the crowds will notice, the people around will notice, and they will put a stop to this person, right, through this shame-honor culture. And no fighting happens, and no running happens. There is passive resistance, and the injustice is put to an end. And it's done so peaceably. And so this whole scenario of turning the other cheek in not fighting, in not running away, but in passively resisting, is called by some scholars the third way. The third way. And so the most recent, at least in terms of our human history, within the last few generations, that is the most iconic form of passive resistance that I can think of, is the man who stands in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square in China. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just look up the video on Google. It's amazing. It takes such courage and strength because it's the same instance, right? Here you are, this military force trying to stop the protesters in China who are trying to protest injustice as they see it. And they don't have weapons, they don't have bombs, they don't have tanks, they just have themselves and their bodies. And this one man walks in front of the tank basically saying, like, if you run me over, it is going to bring so much shame and disgrace upon you that alone will take you down, or at least it will begin to. And it's just amazing. Just watch the video if you haven't seen it. And so, with passive resistance in mind, right, not that that's directly said in Peter today, but it's a part of what Peter's talking about. I ask you, like, what does that look like for us as people of faith today? Right? Because Jesus calls us to do this. There are injustices in the world that require that we step in and resist. Not violently, and not run away and bury our head in the sand, but resist. Might that be just simply getting out and voting? right? If the politicians locally, statewide, or nationally aren't taking care of the most vulnerable and your neighbor and loving them as Jesus would have you love them and as Jesus calls them to love them, vote them out, right? That's passively resisting. Maybe it means letter writing campaigns, organizing people, finding something you care about, and then writing to your representatives about it. Maybe it means actually marching on capitals, like the teenagers from Florida, right, for the March for Our Lives. Maybe it means hosting educational events. Sometimes the only reason that people make poor decisions and do unjust things is because they're just ignorant and they don't know about it. And so teach people about things. And when you teach people about things, sometimes that helps solve the problem, and that's done peaceably. Maybe it means, like I and some of my other colleagues have done, forming a non-for-profit that seeks to fund and care for things that the government seemingly refuses to do so, even though Jesus calls us to care for them. And so I just want to reiterate, please know that we do this passively resisting and encouraging our leaders and our government and our structures to do things, not simply for ourselves. This isn't an individualistic task. In fact, it shouldn't be focused on ourselves. It should be focused on those who are most vulnerable, our neighbor. Jesus calls us to love, the little children who are the most vulnerable, the sick, the lame, the hungry, the poor, right? That's who we are called to take care of. Just read Matthew 25 after this, and you'll see what I mean. And as we do this, right, to bring it back to Peter, as we resist in this way in order to love our neighbor who is most vulnerable, Peter writes, as servants of God, then we live as free people. And we're not using our freedom then as a pretext for evil, and we are honoring everyone. We are loving the family of believers. We are fearing, that is, respecting and revering God, and we are honoring the emperor. And so in this time when there are many who are vulnerable and in need, I guess I'll end by asking this. How might you use your voice? How might you use your voice to speak out for the most vulnerable, who might not be getting heard right now because, quite frankly, their voice is just not the loudest one right now, right? And so people aren't paying attention. How might you use your voice to give voice and support those who are most vulnerable right now, who aren't being heard because their voice is not loud enough or strong enough or organized enough? And I'll tell you this, I don't do this very often, but I get emails from different associations who do this type of stuff. And I actually wrote to Congressman Wahlberg this week, literally just like a day or two ago, about something I deeply care about, and voicing to him that I want him to make sure that a resolution at Congress gets passed. I also got an email from a charity that I support that they are getting hurt really bad by COVID-19, and I donated some extra money to help the children of that organization in Guatemala, because they're not being heard from. They're not the people most people think about. They are on the margins, and they are beautiful, good people, and God loves them. And so those are the ways that I know that I've been able to help out, and I'm sure there's more. And I'm not perfect. I'm not saying this to toot my own horn. I'm just saying there are things we can do. And Peter, in his verse today, in his letter, is encouraging us to do so, because it's part of the earlier verse from yesterday of shewing forth, of proclaiming the mighty acts of God that has brought us from darkness into light, right? Deliverance, just like Exodus. It isn't just for us, but it's for those around us. Since we've been freed, we are called to give freedom and justice to others. And so God bless you in finding your own ways to do that during this time of pandemic where many are feeling enslaved. I hope you can give freedom and hope, life and love to many around you in the name of Jesus. With that, I'll say I'll talk to you tomorrow.